Recording in progress.
So I think you can start. I'm just going to present yourself again. And then you can start. Bueno, bienvenidos a todos. Esta es la tercera y última sesión del curso de Yamin Levy acerca del pensamiento de Rambam y de Ramban. Les pido si pueden prender sus cámaras para que se sienta un poco más amena la clase. And whenever you want to start, we're ready.
Thank you, Esperanza, and thank you those that are here. In the last two sessions, we looked at texts that really highlight significant differences in thinking between Nachmanides and Rambam, Maimonides. And when I first began the session, I noted that really someone who studies these two scholars, these two great scholars of Spain, could think that we're talking about two different worlds of thinking. And what I want to begin with today, before I get into the last subject matter that highlights a very meaningful and significant difference, I want to give some context. And I'm a firm believer, and I mentioned this early on in our series, that despite Nachmanides' public positions against Rambam and his intellectual commitment to the Zohar and to Kabbalah and to the world of Sod, and his belief in astrology and necromancy and magic, I believe firmly that there was a great appreciation that Nachmanides had for the Andalusian tradition. And I think there is some evidence to that very fact. Just a little bit of context. Andalusia was finished by the 1150s. I don't know if there were any Jews left in Andalusia by the 1150s. Jews dispersed. Most went north to Catalan, and some even went into, France. The Ibn Tibon families went into southern France. Rambam and others went south. Some went to North Africa, others went to Egypt, some went to Bavel, which is modern-day Iraq. And northern Spain and southern France welcomed these Jews from Andalusia who were intellectuals, were grammarians, were Jews who were fluent in Judeo-Arabic. And so you have the families of the Ibn Tibon that began to translate the works of Rambam and Bachya ibn Pakuda to educate the communities of Europe, of northern Spain. And I would say some 80 years after the destruction of Andalusia, sometime in the 1230s, when Rambam's works were translated into Hebrew for the Jews of that region, there began a movement to ban the works of Rambam. And here began what is called, in academic circles, the Maimonidean controversy. The great saintly Rabbi Shlomo of Montpellier, he banned publicly the study of the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide, and Sefer Hamada. said, we will welcome Harambam's halachic works, except Sefer Hamada, which includes elements of Maaseh Bereshit, Maaseh Merkavah, and certain elements of philosophy regarding miracles and Nevuah, etc. He actually sent one of his students, Rabbeinu Yonah of Gironde, to France to try to rally up the communities there to accept this ban on the study of Harambam. Nachmanides at this time was about 30 years old. He was a young, recognized, brilliant scholar. And he jumped into this controversy. And he wrote a very important letter, a famous letter, to the rabbis of northern France and Europe, asking them to retract their cherem, retract their excommunication of Harambam's books, in particular of the Moreh Nevuchim and Sefer Madam. And it's a brilliantly beautiful, brilliantly written letter from a literary point of view. I didn't bring the letter to study with you because it's a long letter and it would take an entire session or two just to go through the letter. But he begins by being very self-effacing. He says, I am nothing next to you, great Torah scholars. And he refers to these rabbis as the faces of the Merkavah, the princes of Israel, the great teachers of Judaism. And he gives 3 reasons why they should retract their cherem against Harambam. The first reason he gives is that the world of Andalusia was culturally very different than the world of Judaism they're living and they're experiencing in northern Spain, in France, and in Germany. And he says, correctly so, that you're mixing apples and oranges here. And the guide, the Moreh Nevuchim and Sefer Hamadah was appropriate for the Jews in Andalusia, may not be appropriate for the Jews, but it's not a reason to create a cherem against these works. Second reason he gives is because it's devastating to Jewish unity. We're going to tear the Jewish people apart. Harambam has a huge following. In fact, he had a big following of Jews in southern France, in Provence. Rabbeinu David Kimchi was a great follower of Harambam. And Nachmanides points out in his letter that if you proceed with this cherem, you're going to create a great division among the people of Israel. And the third point he makes, and this point is very, very critical. He notes how Rambam's teachings in the Moreh Nevuchim and in Sefer Hamadah are not Andalusian innovations. Rambam was heir to the tradition of the Geonim, who were heir to certain schools of the Talmud. And I make a big deal about this in my book, The Mysticism of Andalusia, because I argue that Harambam devoted his creative energies to recording a tradition he was heir to, not writing a new tradition, like some of the scholars in Israel like to argue. The book that changed Judaism by Mika Goodman. That's wrong. The Moreh Nevuchim didn't change Judaism. It's a record of a tradition that was alive and well, beginning with Rav Sadia Gaon and many of the Gaonim. And Nachmanides makes this point very, very clearly. And he succeeds in having the ban revoked. Unfortunately, Rabbeinu Yonah was very zealous, and he turned Rambam's books to the Franciscans, who were burning the books of heresy in the Catholic Church, and he said, if you're burning your heretics, burn ours as well. And that's what led to the burning of Rambam's books, and then that's what led to the burning of the Talmud and Jewish books, which was a horror in the history of our people. Nachmanides in this letter refers to Rambam as the tower of the Talmud, the sanctuary of the masses. And he ends the letter by saying that there is countless numbers of people that Rambam has brought back to Judaism or has kept within the fold of Judaism because of his great works. And here was the young Nachmanides, a brilliant scholar of northern Spain, of Catalonia, Barcelona, who was able to preserve the dignity of Rambam in the face of potential crisis and disunity. And he had the cherem revoked. Other evidence to Nachmanides' sensitivities to the scholarship of Andalusia could be found in one of his disputations against or with the Catholic Church. You know, Nachmanides unfortunately had to spend much of his intellectual energy debating the Catholic Church. The Catholics thought that this was one good way of preserving or proving that Judaism is inferior to Catholicism. And so they had these public debates. And one of their debaters was a Jew that converted to Christianity, who was very well read in Judaism and in Midrash. And he kept bringing all these Midrashim that needed a response. And Nachmanides, very interestingly enough, in contrast to the scholarship of northern Spain and Europe, argued that when it comes to Agadah and Midrash, we have to take it very seriously, but not literally. And this is the approach that the Jews of Andalusia had when it came to Midrash. Midrash is something that has to be decoded, has to be taken very seriously. It's the teachings of the Chachamim, but they're not meant to be taken literally. And in my book, I give some examples, one of which is very funny, where Rambam mocks the way some people read a Midrash in a literal way, which makes absolutely no sense. But here we have Nachmanides, who's saying the very same thing. Another example could be found in Ramban's introductory poem to his commentary on Chumash. I'm holding here my Perush Ramban al HaTorah, edited by Rabbi Chaim Shavel, and Nachmanides here says something very sweet. I'm going to read it to you and translate it for you. He says, Perushe Rabbeinu Shlomo, the commentary of Rabbeinu Shlomo Yitzchaki, which is Rashi, Ateret Tzevi, Utzefirat Tiferet, the crown of beauty, Mukhtar b'nimus, b'mikra, b'mishnah, b'gemara. He is crowned with excellence in both Mikra, Mishnah, and Gemara. Lo mishpata bechora. Rashi will be the firstborn heir of my commentary. Bidvarav ehege be'ahavatam eshge. In his words, I will take pleasure and great love. And with great love, I will study them. Ve'imahem yelanu masau mata drisha v'chakira, and we will study Rashi's words very carefully. Then he goes on and he says, Ve'im Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra, and with the commentary of Rabbeinu Avraham ben Ezra, Ibn Ezra, which was one of the great, and if you want a class that'll be fascinating, we should study Ibn Ezra, one of the great Andalusian scholars. He says the following: Tiyeh lanu tochacha megula ve'ahava mesuteret. We will have a public rebuke of his words, but we will have a private, what word am I looking for? We'll have a concealed love for his works. So you hear in the words of Nachmanides this profound appreciation for the world of Andalusia. And despite that, the worlds of Rambam and Nachmanides are very far apart. So what I want to study with you today is, let me find the text that I'm looking for. I want to study with you the WorldView and their approach to sacrifices, korbanot. Sacrifices make up, I would say, a good 30% of our Torah. Most of Sefer Vayikra, a good chunk of Bemidbar, portions, the whole idea of building the Mishkan and the Mizbeach is to bring sacrifices. And Rambam, in his Moreh Nevuchim, has a very, very fascinating approach to the whole idea of sacrifices. And he builds up to this idea. And if you're interested, it's chapter 32 through 36 in section 3 of the Moreh Nevuchim. So let's read a few texts. Here I have a few texts in the Moreh Nevuchim. I have a text in Nachmanides, and we'll see some of the implications in some other texts in Rambam. So Rambam says the following, and again, these are long passages. I didn't want to burden you with reading through long passages, so I'm just pulling out little clips, and we'll say something about it, and hopefully I'll give you a flavor so that you can go back to the original texts yourself and hopefully study them. Rambam says the following: the familiar mode of worship, the way of life we grew up in, prevalent throughout the world in those days, just meant sacrificing various animals in temples where those images were erected, bowing down to them and burning incense before them. The pious and devout in those days worshipped only in temples dedicated to the stars, as I explained. So with the wisdom and grace evident throughout creation, God did not decree that his law simply annul, reject, and abolish all such worship. Premise number one, how Rambam begins with, is that to create change, especially spiritual change in an individual, it has to be done slowly. You can't just come and say, oh, we're going to reject everything you know, and we're going to start from scratch. It doesn't work that way. How Rambam actually gives an example. He says, why is it that when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, why didn't God choose the most direct path to the land of Israel? Derech Eretz Pilishtim, the path of the Philistines. They would have been in Israel in 2 days, 3 days. And he says, the Pasuk says, because lest there would be war and the Jews would come back running to Egypt. Rambam says, why didn't the God just make them great warriors, military heroes? We made miracles, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea. Why not just make the Jewish people now warriors? And our Rambam says, premise number one, God will not change the human being. Never. The human being has to change himself or herself. That's why they had to spend 40 years in the desert to transform from slaves to warriors who can self-govern. Number two, the common practice in those days was animal sacrifice. That's what everybody did, every religion did. And so Rambam says, God didn't come and say, okay, no more animal sacrifice, we're just going to pray to God. People are going to say, what kind of religion is that? Doesn't make any sense. Impossible. And so it had to happen progressively and slowly. Rambam adds, and I want to read one more passage over here in Rambam. The Torah, as Onkelos reads it, tells us clearly that the ancient Egyptians worshipped the constellation Aries. So they prohibited the slaughter of sheep and abominated shepherds and the abominated shepherds. Beyond that, some Sabian sects are early pagans, pre-Muslim pagans, worshipped jinn and believed they took the form of a goat. Such beliefs were quite common and widespread in the days of our teacher Moshe. As the Torah writes, no more shall they sacrifice to goats. So these sects forbade eating goat meat. Also, slaughtering cattle was abhorrent to nearly all pagans. They all venerated these beasts. So you will find even today Hindus never slaughter cattle, even in lands where other beasts are slaughtered. In order to blot out all traces of such unsound beliefs, then, we were commanded to sacrifice animals of 3 kinds, specifically of the herd and flock. Our Rambam here, in a much larger and longer essay, explains that the whole purpose of the korbanot was to precisely sacrifice the animals that were worshipped by the pagan of that ancient world. And by sacrificing them, we show that we don't believe in them. We reject those beliefs. We reject that form of avodah zarah. That's why we have the Korban Pesach is a lamb, how Rambam explains. the lamb was worshipped by the Egyptians. I would even argue further, the lamb was roasted publicly so that all of Egypt smelled the roasting of the lamb. A lamb smells very different when it's cooked, when it's roasted. And so for Rambam, the whole idea of sacrifices was a means towards the transformation, spiritual transformation of the Jewish people. It was just one step closer to where they had to go spiritually. And so point number 2 in Rambam in these chapters is that change happens gradually. He explains this. I think I have a quote down here. Where is it? Maybe I don't. Here, in Marah. When the Jewish people came out of Mitzrayim, their first stop was in Marah, where the water was bitter and then it was sweetened. And the Pasuk says, Vayomer im shamoa tishma lekol Adonai Elohecha. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, if you shall surely listen to Hashem, ve'ayashar beinav ta'aseh, and you'll do that which is right in Hashem's eyes, ve'azanta lemitzvotav, and you will hear His commandments, ve'shamarta kol chukav, and you will certainly observe His chukim. Kol ha'machala shesamti b'mitzrayim lo asim alecha. All the diseases that I placed upon Egypt, I won't place upon you. Ki ani Hashem el rofecha. I am the Lord your God who heals you. And the Gemara in Masechet Yuma says that here God commanded Shabbat and all the civil laws. So Rambam develops this very beautifully. Rambam says that initially, when God revealed His glory to Avraham Avinu, it was only a theological expectation that Avraham and his progeny should know God, should not worship idols, should know the truth that there's a creator in heaven, affirm God's truth in the world. Then the Jews went down to Mitzrayim, and they went to Lametet, Memtet, Sharei Tumah. They went to the lowest levels of Tumah and Avodah Zarah, and they failed in the mission of Avraham Avinu. So Rambam says, when they came to Marah, so God added a few more commandments, Shabbat, civil laws. But then what happened? They sinned with the golden calf, Chet HaEgel. And that's where Moshe Rabbeinu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu understood that there has to be a slower process. And so they had the building of the Mishkan, they had the bringing of Korbanot, which ultimately would ideally lead to a closeness to God and rejection of Avodah Zarah. This entire philosophy is absolutely rejected by Nachmanides. Completely rejected by Nachmanides. And I'm going to read a little passage here, Ramban in Vayikra. Right at the beginning of Vayikra, Ramban says the following: Ve'amar harav b'moreh hanevuchim. The rabbi writes in the Moreh HaNevuchim, Kitam HaKorbanot, the reason for the Korbanot, Ba'avur shemitzrayim, shemitzrim ve'akazdim, asher hayu Israel garim ve'toshavim be'artzam, because the Egyptians and the Kazdim, among whom the Jewish people lived, me'olam hayu ovdim labakar ve'latzon, they would worship their herds, their animals, their goats. Ki ha-Mitzrim ovdim latele, the Mitzrim worship the lamb, ve'akazdim ovdim lashedim asher iru lahem bitmut seirim, and the Kazdim worship demons that took on the image of the goat. Ve'anshei hodu ad hayom lo yishchetu bakar leolam, and the Hindus, the Indians, up even today, says Nachmanides, do not slaughter their cattle. Ba'avur kain tziva lishchot ele hashlosha minin l'shem hanichbad. So Rambam, Nachmanides tells us that Rambam is saying that's why God commanded that we should slaughter these three types of animals. Kedei sheyuda ki hadavar shehayu choshvin ki hem betachlit ha'avera hu asher yakrivu leboreh ubo yitchaper havonot ki kein yitrapu ha'emunot ha'raot shehem midevi ha'nefesh. And so, according to Rambam, says Nachmanides, we're obligated to slaughter these animals, and by killing them, by slaughtering them, we're going to reject their false beliefs, the emunot haraot, that are the sicknesses of the soul. Ki kol madveh v'chol choli lo yitrape ki im behofcho ele behofcho ele dvarav. And the only way, says Maimonides, says Rambam, to reject these beliefs is by doing the opposite, by killing them. Nachmanides says, "Ve'eled varav." These are the words of Rambam. Ubahem he'erich, and he elaborated on this. Ve'hinei heim divrei havai irapu shever gadol ve'kushia rabba al nikla. He says that this is nonsense. The words of Rambam are nonsense, he says, and they raise many questions. Yasu shulchan Hashem megoal, that they make the table of God ugly. She'einenu rak lehotzi milban shel reshaim v'tipshei olam. He says, how could the korbanot only be in order to reject the false beliefs of the pagans? Ve'akatuv amar ki hem lechem ishel lereach nichoach. The pasuk says that the korbanot are reach nichoach, a pleasant smell for God, a pleasantness for God. Ramban Nachmanides continues by saying that the whole purpose of korbanot is for God. God needs it. It serves God. And herein lies this huge difference between Rambam and Nachmanides. For Nachmanides, we bring korbanot because God needs it. For Rambam, we bring korbanot because we need to change. We need to transform ourselves. And this difference runs through a lot of Jewish practice. For Rambam, the whole enterprise of mitzvot is to change the individual, change society, to make the world a better place. In Nachmanides' spiritual worldview, every detail of the mitzvah and every detail of the korban and every ingredient is important because it has an effect on God. And this, of course, is elements that are found in the Zohar and in the Kabbalah. The pasuk says, here's a very interesting idea that furthers this distinction. The pasuk at the end of Shmot says, "Ve'yad'u ki ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim." And the Jewish people will know that I took them out, that I am their Lord God. I took them out of the land of Egypt. Leshochni betocham, to dwell among them. Ani Hashem Elokechem. I am the Lord, your God. Nachmanides here quotes Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and gives his own commentary. Leshochni betocham, al menat lishkon betocham, so that I dwell among them. Lashon Rashi. He quotes Rashi over here. Rashi, if you study that Rashi carefully, Rashi, the lamed before the infinitive of lishkon is a conditional that that I will dwell among them on condition that they recognize that I am the Lord God who took them out of Egypt. And Nachmanides says, Halamid bitnai kazeh nimtza. We don't see a lamed functioning grammatically this way. Ve'itachen sheyomar ve'yad'u b'shochni betocham. It's possible, he says, that the pasuk means that ve'yadu, they will know after I dwell among them, they will know ki ani Hashem Elohehem asher hotzeiti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. By the very function of my dwelling amongst them, they will recognize that I am their God who took them out of Egypt. Ki yad'u kvodi v'yaminu shani hotzeiti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. They will recognize my great honor, and they will believe that I took them out of the land of Egypt. V'hu kederech vahi David lechol derachav maskil. That's the way the lamed works. Vahi David lechol derachav maskil. David was maskil wherever he went. And then he explains as follows. Aval Rabbi Avraham Amar Rabbeinu Avraham ibn Ezra says, Ki lo hotzeiti otam meretz Mitzrayim rak ba'avur ki im eshkon betocham. Ibn Ezra has a little bit of a different reading. It says, the whole purpose why I took them out of the land of Egypt was so that I dwell among them. V'zehu ta'avdun et ha'elohim al harazeh. That's the whole purpose of you will worship the Lord your God on this mountain. And Nachmanides says, V'yafeh piresh kein yesh b'inyan sod gadol. Nachmanides says, here lies a great secret. Ki kefi pshat hadavar, according to the simple reading of the text, hashechina beIsrael tzorech hedyot. The simple reading of the text is that God's presence in Israel is for the purposes of the human being, velo tzorech gavoa, and not for higher purposes. Avalhu keinyan shamar, but Nachmanides says no. The entire purpose of the Shekhinah, he says, is for God's purposes. It's it's not for the human being, but rather for God. Keinyan shamar katuv Israel asher bechait pa'er. The Jewish people make God glorious. And it's a complicated reading in the Ramban, but if you read Chavel's commentary on this, he says, Bi'ur divrei Rabbeinu, kefi ma shebi'arnu, kefi ma shebi'aru talmidav ha'mekubalim mimenu amru bazeh lashon. To understand Nachmanides, you have to understand the way his students understood him. His students were the mekubalim. Hakavana bazeh, ki lefi apshat haya nireh, ki hashchina be'Yisrael tzorech hedyotu. The pshuto shel mikra appears that the whole purpose of the Shekhinah is for the purpose of the human being. Aval derech hasod eino kein, ela letzorech gavoa. But according to the sod, no. It's all about affecting the heavens and changing the heavens. And that's the purpose of the Mishkan, and that's the purpose of the mitzvot. And Rambam says, reject such a notion. For example, regarding the Mishkan, by this injunction, we are commanded to build a sanctuary for his service. Their sacrifices are to be offered and the perpetual fires to burn per the prescribed ingredients. Pilgrimages are to be made, and there the festivals and assemblages are to be held every year, as will be explained. This injunction is contained in his words, and let them make for me a sanctuary. We build the Mishkan for our purposes, to gather the people, to bring sacrifices that will benefit us and change us spiritually. In the Nachmanides worldview, it's about our affecting God. And that is a position that the Jews of Andalusia could never accept. We don't change God. We don't affect God. God doesn't need us. I don't need to mention that Rambam quotes many of the Nevi'im who reject the idea of God needing korbanot. Yirmiyahu Hanavi says, Mali rov sivchechem, what do I need all your sacrifices for? And so here again lies this big difference between these two great Torah giants. And so we go back to where we began, and we'll close with this idea that yes, we have two great Torah giants that speak to two very different views of Judaism, of Torah, and of mitzvot, and of Jewish philosophy. My hope and prayer is that every one of us find the Torah scholar that resonates most with them and speaks to them. And as long as we stay in the path of Torah and mitzvot, and we follow that which our Torah asks of us, Shivim panim la Torah, there are many, many angles and faces to Torah, and we embrace all of them. Any questions? Any thoughts? This is, again, I pulled together just a few sources for this three-part series. There's much more that we can talk about this, but I think I will leave it at that. Thank you, Esperanza. I appreciate the opportunity to have studied with you guys a little bit.
Thank you. Our pleasure is ours. I wanted to ask you something.
Sure.
You told about the Rambam's Maimonides view of the korbanot, that the change had to be gradually. So if the change had to be gradually, the korbanot are not the ultimate goal.
Correct. Definitely not the ultimate.
Maybe it was what they needed when they came out of Egypt to.
That's exactly what Rambam says.
All the paganism they live within Egypt. But
Correct.
right now, nowadays, maybe that's not our goal. Maybe our goal is just to simply
to pray, to meditate, to learn, to study. Absolutely right. And I say this without reservation and without apologetics. If we built a third Beit HaMikdash, I sure hope that we're going to follow Rambam, and we're not going to be slaughtering animals in Jerusalem, thousands at a time like they did in Shlomo HaMelech's time, because there will be a revolution in the world. You know what I'm saying to you? That would not be the way of the future. Absolutely not. And that's the beauty of Rambam. I'm so grateful to Rambam for putting that out there. If I'm saying to you, it makes the building of the third Beit HaMikdash much more sensible for someone like me.
That's true.
You see what I'm saying to you?
Yeah.
The third Beit HaMikdash will be a place of spirituality, of prayer, of meditation, of scholarship. But I don't believe, as Rambam did, it'll be a place where we're going to be slaughtering animals right and left.
But I remember that I studied once that the Rambam he states that in Yemei Mashiach, and when we have the third Bet HaMikdash, we will continue slaughtering animals, not with the same purpose.
No,
No.
no. That's Nachmanides, but not Rambam.
Okay.
Though in Rambam's Mishneh Torah, he does write all the laws of Shechita and all the laws of Korbanot, because the Mishneh Torah is a complete compilation of Jewish law, including the laws of the Bet HaMikdash. But in the future, third Bet HaMikdash, She'yavo b'mirabi Amenu, according to Rambam, there will not be sacrifices. That's past. We don't need it anymore. Avodah Zarah is gone from the world.
Okay.
Rabbi, but that has like a very big implication, because that means that the Torah is not for every generation. And also, as you mentioned, it's a big part of the Torah, like every specification of every korban.
Correct.
So
You're absolutely right, Miss Daniela. The Torah is a system of spiritual growth and change. And mitzvot are to affect the individual, affect community, and change the world. Now, our Torah that we observe today is locked in the system of the last Sanhedrin, the last Supreme Court of Israel, which is the close of the Talmud. And when we have a brand new Sanhedrin, Be'ezrat Hashem b'mirabi Amenu, a Sanhedrin of 71 great scholars, unified all the Jewish people, Judaism might take on variations, differences, the way it looks today. But you need a Sanhedrin for that. You follow what I'm saying?
even if it's the Oraita, even if this is like written law, it's not Talmud, it's written.
No. Again, the Oraita depends on how it's interpreted. You follow what I'm saying to you? It's how it's interpreted.
Yes. Okay.
Let me just say, Nevuchim 3:32. I'm just answering one of the, well, you know what? It's actually start with 3:26 to 3:32. Yeah. Okay, good. Those are good questions. Very good questions. And I'm an orphan. I get into trouble for saying these things, but I don't make it up. It's a Rambam. It's our teachings. My teacher, Rabbi Faor, this is what what he taught, and this is, we can't apologize for Rambam. That was his teachings. This was the Torah of Andalusia.
And Nachmanides doesn't have a problem explaining why does a perfect being like God needs something like that.
That's a big problem philosophically, but he didn't embrace the philosophical questions. You see, not just a perfect being. God is infinite. God is immutable. Immutable means unchanging. And so anyone who's philosophically sensitive recognizes God doesn't need anything from me at all. But we do it to sensitize ourselves, to spiritualize ourselves, to bring us closer to the truth of God, to love Hashem, to be in awe of Hashem. I encourage you to read my book. I don't mean to promote my book, but I do encourage you. It's a unique book. There's nothing like it out there at all. And wait till I have another book coming up, and a third one after this that is speaking to these points very, very saliently.
Thank you, Rabbi. I will try to find it here in Mexico. Bezrat Hashem.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Hatzlacha, good luck. Please stay in touch, Esperanza and your whole group. All right?
We're so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Being with us, and we were so happy to hear from you.
I
and
appreciate it. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care, guys. Laila tov. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you. Bye.